Hello, everybody. Happy to be here with you today and to share with you some of our thoughts at Minerva about what it means to offer an education that is effective and truly interdisciplinary, what we refer to as authentic interdisciplinarity. Interdisciplinary education has been around for a long time, but there hasn't been much excitement about interdisciplinary education because historically it has been implemented both without much purpose and without the effectiveness that you would hope for a new form of education. And we believe that interdisciplinary education begins with a particular premise, a premise not about interdisciplinarity itself, but about what education is about, specifically secondary and post-secondary education, which we believe has an obligation to nurture the best in humans, to actually make humans extraordinary. And that premise is what Minerva has been doing since 2011. We've built the most innovative university in the world that has better outcomes than Ivy League universities, Oxford, Cambridge, to students that come from much more challenging economic backgrounds. Through our own university and programs we've worked on with other institutions, we've reached more than 30,000 learners over the years and trained more than 1,000 faculty members. And we've worked with more than 30 partners around the world to build them Minerva programs. And so I wanted to explain, what does it mean to transform an institution, and how does it begin with an understanding of purpose, and then to show how interdisciplinarity can enable that purpose. Now, I'm going to use a higher education example, but the same is true of high school, and just be able to understand what the relationship is. I'll refer to some of the parallels, but I think some of the parallels will be obvious. Let's imagine a strange scenario. A university has decided to shift its tennis program from the athletic department to an academic college and design a training program for tennis players the way they design all of their other programs. What would that look like? Well, in a traditional curricular structure, the university would want to make sure that there's a rigorous approach to tennis education. So that means that the tennis player will have to learn the various components of being a great tennis player. They're going to have to really understand joints, specifically wrists and hips, shoulders and elbows. They're going to have to really get deep understanding, that is, around those physiological components of the body. They're also going to have to, of course, understand bouncing and the physics and science behind bouncing, different surfaces, different conditions, air pressure, humidity, etc. It's also quite important to understand the psychology behind grunting. And, let's not forget that in order to really be able to be great at a particular sport, you have to understand the history of those other greats that came before you in the same sport. Now, a university would argue you can't really know any of those things without having prerequisite courses. You can't really understand joints before you understand human anatomy overall. You can't really understand bouncing before you understand material science, right? And of course, how can you understand material science without doing research? You can't understand the psychology of grunting without understanding social psychology. You can't understand the greats of tennis without understanding sports history in general. And of course, you can't do any of those underlying courses without understanding the fundamentals. How can you understand material science without understanding physics? How can you understand anatomy without understanding biology? Of course, you need calculus to understand trajectories and parabolas, etc. You need to understand the basic psychology in order to understand social psychology. And of course, you have to understand Western civilization to be able to understand sports history. And of course, you have to have a writing requirement. And so you do all of these things, and then you write a big paper at the end, and then clearly you're going to be a great tennis player. Well, obviously, this is an absurd approach. But it's actually the approach that most universities and high schools take in order to design their academic programs. And so the question is, how can higher education actually advance human potential? And so we think about what is the ultimate outcome for the learner. What kinds of skills do we want the learner to have when they graduate? So, for example, we think about the abilities of the graduate of an institution, be it a high school or university or what have you. And skills and abilities roughly break into two core parts. There's personal, what you do by yourself, and interpersonal, what you do in interaction with others. And they can break down into the big four core competencies that we all know and have heard about ad nauseum. How to be a great critical thinker, how to be a great creative thinker, how to be able to effectively communicate, to effectively collaborate or interact. But the issue is that most of the work around the four C's ends there. You say, teach these things. The problem is that these core competencies aren't individual things. They're comprised of subcompetencies. Critical thinking has several subcompetencies, including things like evaluating claims or making decisions. And those subcompetencies have further learning outcomes within them that together create the subcompetencies, that together then create the core competencies that then enable a certain ability for the learner. And so when we think about what it is that an educational program should be doing, we think about those goals first. And that opens up a much better understanding of what interdisciplinary education should be about. Because each disciplinary approach should reinforce these central themes. Let me give you an example using the concept of iterative design. Now, if you were to think about what it is that you would teach a student about iterative design, what you would do at a traditional university program is make sure that a student can explain what iterative design is about. Having divergent thinking and then some convergence, diverging again and converging slowly over time before you go through, before you actually be able to implement. It's a process, well-known technique, has 5 stages, and you would make sure that the student would learn those basics. And of course, in any program, including a Minerva program, without knowing what something is, you can't really study it. And so the basic definition is crucial. But the assessment of that piece of knowledge in many institutions, in many courses within those institutions, is binary. Can you define iterative design? Tell me the 5 steps. In a more sophisticated version, you will get a linear type of assessment framework. How well do you know iterative design? In rare cases at a university, you'll actually be asked, can you apply, in this case, iterative design, but something that you have learned? But that is basically where things stop. And in most cases, they don't even get to that point. Think about the enormous amount of information you learn in high school, at a university. How many of those facts, figures, how many of those pieces of knowledge were you actually assessed on how you apply or how you use, as opposed to just whether or not you remember them correctly or how well you can remember them and to what level of detail? Now, for real education, you actually need to not only understand whether or not you can apply what it is that you've learned, but also be able to understand how effectively can you apply what it is that you've learned. And that means not just on a linear fashion, did you do well or not well, but to actually start putting different types of scenarios, contexts under which you will apply what it is that you have been learning. And if your assessment framework is done correctly, the real measure of learning is how broadly can you effectively apply what it is that you have learned. Now, how do you do that in a traditional curriculum? You see that in a traditional curriculum, you have core courses, you have foundational major courses, you have advanced courses, you have electives, of course, within them, you have various experiences that go throughout them that are not course-based experiences, you have a capstone thesis at the end, etc. So it looks very traditional in higher education. In high school, you may not have capstone theses, you may not have more electives or experiential learning, but you certainly have your core courses and electives throughout. Now imagine that we wanted to teach iterative design. We would introduce that in a core class, for example, design thinking, but then we would make sure that that iterative design shows up in various other classes, electives, majors, experiences, etc. But the reality is that even though it may be a main focus of some courses, it will wind up showing up in many other courses and experiences, all of which the student gets assessed on how well they're applying iterative design, being aware that the context in which they're applying it is quite different. But iterative design is just one component, one learning objective of a number, not three, actually many more, that make up creative thinking. And each one of those is just an example of that one bucket. There are different numbers of learning objectives that make up critical thinking, effective interaction, effective communication. And a good curriculum scaffolds all of them throughout the student's learning journey. Now, in order to make sure that the student is actually absorbing what it is that they're supposed to learn, you also have to affect effective pedagogy within the classroom. You have to make sure that students are paying attention, that they are indeed interacting in class as opposed to just listening. That interaction needs to lead to application, right? Because it's actually what it is that they're being assessed on. The application needs to make sense because the student needs to associate what it is that they're learning with other pieces of knowledge they already have. And of course, they need significant feedback. An interdisciplinary education has at least the structure to be able to take those same learning outcomes and be able to demonstrate them in all sorts of different contexts to further an overall goal. Our goal is to help institutions build these types of opportunities, not just by inspiring a different way of thinking, but actually implementing a system, a technology that enables effective pedagogy, effective curricular design, and an effective assessment mechanism to enable these institutions to offer these types of Minerva programming. We believe that that is the path to creating a world of extraordinary humans. And we don't believe that that is the purview of a few institutions. Our hope is that institutions throughout the world are going to be able to adopt these types of programs and create the kind of future that we all hope for. Thank you very much.